Good.
Hit record.
Okay.
Dr. Grossman, could you please spell your first and last name for us?
Sure. Darren, D-A-R-E-N, Grossman, G-R-O-S-M-A-N.
Okay. And could you give us your full title?
That's MD, PhD.
And your, how would you
I see.
specialty?
Okay.
Your specialty.
Yes.
Your-
Sorry.
That's okay.
I'm a hematologist and a member of the leukemia, lymphoma, and bone marrow transplant program at the Memorial Cancer Institute.
Okay. And could you give us a synopsis of Dawn's case?
Sure. I've known Dawn for about 10 years now. She was actually diagnosed back almost 20 years ago in Canada before moving to the U.S. With a rare form of blood cancer called systemic mastocytosis, or more specifically, indolent systemic mastocytosis, which is a mild form of the disease that's most common.
And could you tell us most recently about your care for Dawn? What led you to consider a clinical trial
Sure.
for Dawn?
The disease in its usual manifestation is a chronic disease that, while not curable, is at least very treatable. Patients can suffer from a range of symptoms from the disease, including rashes, allergic type symptoms, heart palpitations, bone pain. They can vary from being mild to being, in some cases, quite debilitating, affecting their quality of life. Most patients fall somewhere in a spectrum. Usually those symptoms can be managed with a variety of supportive medications. Sometimes they require certain stronger medications like gentle forms of chemotherapy to help manage the symptoms, which was the case with her. And for many years we were able to control her symptoms with a medication called imatinib or Gleevec, which 10-15 years ago was a brand new medication. Now is a standard drug in the armamentarium for more than one of the chronic blood cancers. Dawn did well for quite a while. She's a mother, she is very active, she's an artist, and she's been able to work and travel and have a good quality of life, although she's had symptoms to deal with all along. And as she likes to say, she's had these symptoms for so long now that she's forgotten what it is to live without them. She's forgotten what it is to feel normal. In the last year or two, things began to change. We began to see things that we don't normally see in cases like this. She started to become anemic. She started to have other abnormalities in her blood counts and increased symptoms, even though she was on a stable medication regimen for quite some time. It is very uncommon for a rare disease that is even more rare for this disorder to progress, but it can do so. And in my training in Boston, I have some experience with seeing patients progress to a more advanced form of the disease called aggressive systemic mastocytosis. And unfortunately, that is usually a very poor prognosis. When patients progress, they usually don't respond well to any of the standard medications. Even with aggressive chemotherapy, the prognosis for these patients is generally poor, and life expectancy is very limited. And so certainly for a young patient like Dawn, that was a very concerning finding. And as soon as we had a suspicion that she was in the progress of transforming into a more aggressive form of the disease, we began to reach out to what are unfortunately only a handful of experts in this country who.
Could I interrupt you just a
Mhm.
moment? Backtrack just a moment.
Sure.
So basically, the cancer got to such an aggressive state that it was life-threatening for her?
It was not immediately life-threatening, but all the signs were there that she was progressing to that point.
Could I have you back up then and just from the point
Sure.
where you described that her cancer, because the medication wasn't working for her, that it had turned aggressive, and that she was leading toward
Sure.
A possible life-threatening.
Sure, sure. So, in addition to some of her general symptoms worsening, Dawn was beginning to develop severe bone pains from expansion of the cancer in her bone marrow. Her blood counts, because her bone marrow, which is the factory for your blood cells in the body, was becoming affected severely by the disease. She was becoming so anemic that she was requiring regular, repeated blood transfusions. Her white count and her platelet count were dropping, which are things that put her at risk for potentially severe infections and bleeding complications. And so all of the signs were there that in a relatively short period of time we could be dealing with potentially serious and even life-threatening complications going forward.
Could you walk us through, given the urgency of Dawn's case, and could you walk us through the steps that you took to learn about the clinical trial as an option, and how you proceeded with that?
Sure. So again, this is to begin with a rare, sometimes people refer to it as an orphan disease because of how uncommon it is. This is not a disease for which large national studies are done and for which pharmaceutical companies are in the habit of developing new drugs. And there are only really a handful of people in the country who study it. It is even more rare, again, for this disease to progress into an aggressive form. Having seen this in the past in my training, having done a fellowship in blood cancers in Boston, and appreciating the sort of the urgency and the potential for a bad outcome if this progressed much further, I began to reach out to those experts in the country who do study and do research specifically in this disorder. Unfortunately, I discovered that in the last 10 or 20 years, not much had changed, and there really hadn't been any real advances in the management for such patients. However, I did also find out that there had been a recent small study done of a promising new drug from a pharmaceutical company called Novartis that examined just this patient population with promising results and in some cases very dramatic responses. Unfortunately, that study had already been closed to what we call accrual, which means it was no longer available to enroll patients. And there really was no standard means, not yet having been approved by the FDA. There was no standard mechanism by which to get access to this drug. So at the recommendation of the lead researcher on the study at Stanford University, I reached out directly to the pharmaceutical company, both at their headquarters here in the United States and in Europe, to see if there would be some way to get what we call expanded access or use of the drug on what we call a compassionate use basis for a single patient who has an urgent need.
And what did you do to, could you talk us through what the steps that you took of contacting the drug manufacturer?
Sure.
And how you set up the process, how you set things up in place for Dawn to
Sure,
proceed?
sure. So this sort of thing, gaining access to investigate drugs that are still investigational for patients, actually used to be a somewhat simpler process. In the modern era, with all of the regulatory and legal concerns, it's become increasingly complicated, and pharmaceutical companies are increasingly hesitant to release their drugs in such a fashion. I think we were lucky in this case that the company involved was Novartis. It's a company that I actually have experience with in a similar setting in another patient with another disorder. They're a company that I think has always been very responsible about making medications, investigational drugs like this, available for patients in need.
Could you
Sorry.
elaborate on what you did?
Yeah.
Could you, about
Yeah.
calling Europe?
Yeah.
And
So so again, they've always been very good in my experience in this case and other cases in keeping their drugs available for just such an urgency. Receiving a contact name from the lead researcher for the study, we called the Novartis U.S. offices and the coordinator for that drug's clinical studies in the U.S., who put us in touch with her counterpart in Europe, and it required quite a few phone calls and coordinating between the U.S. and Europe. I remember more than one off-hour weekend phone call with somebody in another country, trying to explain the urgency of the situation for our patient, and trying to coordinate the regulatory details. We're very fortunate, and I don't think this would have happened nearly as efficiently as it did, or maybe not at all, unless we were at Memorial and had the resources available to us here. Dr. Sorelli, who is the head of the research offices at Memorial Healthcare System, and her team, under the direction of Dr. Stanley Marks, the chief medical officer, have put in place a clinical trial office and internal review board that is capable of opening clinical trials and capable of helping us work through the regulatory requirements of working with pharmaceutical companies to gain access to medications like this. It's the sort of thing that outside of the setting of a major healthcare system like Memorial or a university hospital, that's really extremely difficult and sometimes not possible to achieve. And so we were very fortunate to have the resources here at Memorial to be able to pursue this for our patient.
Okay, great. Could I have you could I have you repeat that portion about it, about talking about that it took a team basically to address Dawn's case and arrive at a solution that would work for her. You know, as you mentioned, could you just repeat that portion of it for me?
Okay.
About it
Specifically.
Specifically about once you worked with the pharmaceutical company and set up the trial, then the handoff to Dr. Sorelli and her team, and that it took a team here at Memorial to to meet Dawn's needs.
Yeah,
So if you can.
yeah. It's So it is unfortunately. It is unfortunate that it turns out to be quite complicated to do just this sort of thing. Drugs that are commercially available, that have been approved by the FDA, or something that your physician can just write a prescription for or an order for, and it can be administered the same day or within a matter of days. Drugs that have not yet been approved by the FDA, that are still considered investigational, are very hard outside of the setting of a formal clinical trial to get access to. And so it requires a large amount of regulatory work and coordination, essentially everything involved in opening a whole clinical study, except that in this case you're doing it for just a single patient. And so you're really asking a lot of hospital administration and resources to commit a lot to doing something for to benefit a very small, and usually, as in a case like this, a single patient. Whenever this sort of thing has come up here, however, I've always been very grateful and very impressed that the answer has always been yes. And they've always been willing to put that work and that effort in, even when it's for a single patient's need. In this case, it requires not only approval from the pharmaceutical company, willingness of the pharmaceutical company to share a drug that they may be in the process of shepherding through an approval process with the government and the FDA, which is a sensitive thing for them. But it also requires approval, since it's an investigational drug. It may not yet have been proven in large studies. It requires authorization from also the treating institution. So the hospital has to review the scientific data about the drug, has to review the clinical information about the patient, and has to agree that this is a reasonable and ethical choice for this patient to use a potentially unproven medication. And so most hospitals and certainly universities have what's called an institutional review board, which is a body of physicians, researchers, nurses, representatives from sort of all cross sections of the institution to determine if a proposal like this from a physician for a patient is in fact reasonable and an ethical medical decision. And so it requires not only the pharmaceutical company but the treating institution to approve the idea. And then it turns out that you also need to get a cross reference of approval from the Food and Drug Administration. So even though they have not formally approved the medication for universal distribution, they still have to review the proposal from the institution, and they have to review the agreement from the pharmaceutical company to share their medication with the institution, and they have to agree that those two parties are acting reasonably based on the data that they have on the medication. And so it actually requires quite a deal of red tape and regulatory coordination between, you know, 3 different entities: the government, the treating institution, and the pharmaceutical company. So even though this is even though on one level it's a one-on-one decision between a physician and a patient to try something potentially experimental, it actually requires the involvement of in this case, not just national but international agencies to make it happen. So it requires quite a bit of legwork, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of reports, a lot of reviews, and that is a potential roadblock, because in some cases this is a patient who may be in desperate need of a treatment, and it's not the kind of thing that can take many months or years to organize, which sometimes it feels like it's going to take. I have to say,
How long was it in Don's case?
I have to say that in this case and in the other situations where this has been necessary in recent years for us to pursue, we were able to arrange for Dawn to have the medication within a matter of 2 to 3 months. I believe it may have been as little as 8 to 10 weeks. And that's a real sort of testimony to the resources that Memorial was willing and able to put at our disposal to help our patient. Obviously, at the Cancer Center, we tend to have need for experimental treatments not infrequently, and so we have experience at Memorial in the last few years doing things like this for patients. This is maybe my second or third time through a similar process, and in all occasions, everybody at the Cancer Center here and at the health system at large has immediately, when they've perceived the need to help a patient, been willing, like I said, to muster all the resources that we would, for a clinical trial for hundreds of thousands of patients, just to help one patient who needed it. And that's a testimony to the commitment of the institution and the people who work here to helping our patients, and never I've been working in the Cancer Center here for almost 12 years now, and I can say without exaggeration that in that time, when I've presented the need to do something, for a patient who is in clinical need, I have not once never been told no by anybody in the institution, and that reflects a commitment all the way up to the administrative leadership of this healthcare system to put patients first, as they say. It's not just it really is not just a byline here. They really do live by that commitment.
Could you elaborate for us about the value of a compassionate trial, specifically this compassionate trial for Dawn and compassionate use trials for patients in general?
Yeah, compassionate use trials are generally a stop of last resort. Again, because these are usually drugs, or in some cases treatment protocols, or even medical devices or equipment that may not have yet completed their pathway through the approval process, have not been granted final authorization for commercial use by the FDA. These are hard treatments to gain access to, and they are severely restricted in order to protect patient safety. And so the usual means of getting access to a drug like that is through an existing open clinical trial, which are the usual mechanisms that universities and large what we call cooperative groups of hospitals and doctors' offices around the country participate to put people on studies in a very monitored setting with very strict rules and that they're required to comply with to maintain the safety and the privacy of patients involved in these studies. But those studies are not always available. So sometimes a drug is either too early in the development process for those trials to yet be available, or in some cases those trials have closed and the drug is now pending approval by a government agency. And during those sorts of periods, there is no standard means of access to the medication that's sitting on a shelf somewhere. There may be data, there may be evidence that it is promising, safe, effective, but until it's been finally approved, it is not something that patients and physicians have access to, and that that has been the driving force, historically behind these sorts of what we call compassionate use protocols, and it's the name really describes their purpose, which is to make a potentially promising drug available to a small number of patients or patient who may be in urgent need and doesn't have the time to wait for what can be, in some cases, months and months, and unfortunately in some cases years before a drug winds its way through the regular red tape and approval process. And
could you? That was really good. By the way.
Okay.
that was great as far as the description of the compassionate use trial. Could you tell us specifically what did this trial mean for Dawn? The way she puts it is that you saved her life, and she doesn't. She's very passionate about talking about how you truly went above and beyond for her. And just for her, it wasn't, and really that individualized care. But without a doubt, in her mind, she says Dr. Grossman saved her life. And
well,
in that context, because that's what we hear her saying.
Right.
In that context, can you tell us a
Sure.
little about what did this trial mean for her?
Right. Well, I certainly thank Dawn for her kind words, and but it certainly wasn't me. Like I said, this is the sort of thing that that is a team effort in a lot of ways. Certainly, the team here at the Cancer Center and here at Memorial, because there is no way that on my own I would have ever been able to get access to a medication like this. I was able to contact the researchers in the field. I was able to find out about the medication. I was even able to beg and plead before the to get their interest in making the drug available. But this is the sort of thing, again, that involves governmental regulatory agencies, involves institutional review boards, involves literally dozens of people at this hospital, at the pharmaceutical company, and at the government to pull together, and it's actually very encouraging and very heartening to see that even busy people at big institutions like a pharmaceutical company and the FDA, when presented with an emergency request for compassionate use of a medication, can actually put down their day-to-day tasks and make what needs to happen in a time frame that can help somebody.
Can I just
Sorry.
mention?
Yeah.
Dawn had said that this basically changed her whole lifestyle. You know, it gave her quality of life back. Can you kind of talk about that? How
Sure.
something?
Yes.
That's right.
And sure. So, like I said, it involved a lot of people, to pull this together to make it happen, and most importantly, it involved the patient. Dawn is a pleasure to take care of. She is a wonderful person. She is very engaged in her treatment and knowledgeable about her condition, and was able, when presented, with the facts and the options, together with her husband and her family, to make a decision to take a chance on a not entirely proven treatment, because she has a real love of life, and she has a son and a family and a career, and loves to travel, and she wasn't willing to sit back and accept the standard. So the results of that effort on all of our parts has actually been honestly incredibly heartwarming. Dawn has done extremely well, even better than I would have predicted, and even better than I think I'd even hoped. She has had what we call in research circles a near complete or a complete response of her disease in a relatively short period of time with the treatment, which means, in essence, she's had a remission of this advanced, aggressive, rare form of blood cancer in a matter of a few short months on a medication which is simply a pill that she takes twice a day. The old treatments for this disease, which I've already alluded to, tend to be almost universally disappointing, involve much more potentially dangerous and medications like traditional intravenous chemotherapies and things with much more serious side effects. So on a medication that she takes orally twice a day, Dawn has had a complete resolution not only of all of the more recent symptoms that she developed, like the bone pain and the anemia and the requirement for blood transfusions, that prompted our looking for this treatment. But she's even now had resolution of all of her original symptoms, the things that she presented with first almost 20 years ago when she was diagnosed. The milder, more chronic symptoms that had, for her, become her new normal, the things that she'd learned to live with and accept. One of the most poignant times in the course of this whole case for me was one of our follow-up visits, when I was telling Dawn how impressed I was with her lab numbers and the results in her blood, and she just broke down crying. And I at first wasn't sure why, and she told me, no, these are good tears. She says, I just wanted to tell you that this is the first time in 20 years that I've lived free of side effects. And she said that it's been so long that I had forgotten that they were even side effects. I forgot what it was like to feel normal. And she felt like this treatment had given her life back. When a patient, any patient, says something like that to you, but most certainly when a patient with a rare, complicated, potentially life-threatening blood cancer can say something like that to you after taking a medication which, like I said, is a simple oral pill with almost nothing in the way of major side effects, is about the most gratifying thing as a physician, as a cancer specialist that you can hear. And you don't have to ask yourself every day while you get up in the morning and come to work when you can have an experience like that, and you can help somebody in that way.